My name is Amelia Grant. I'm 33 years old and live in Seattle, Washington. I'm a lead software engineer at a fast-growing AI company where I spend most of my time writing code and building systems that can learn like humans do. My life seemed peaceful enough: a small apartment on a high floor overlooking Lake Union, a stable job, and a few friends who truly felt like family. I thought I had left the past behind. Until the day my mother showed up with my younger sister, the one she had always adored, carrying a cold look and an unbelievable request. "Amelia, your sister needs $150,000. Help her out, you make plenty." I looked at them, said nothing, and simply smiled. They had no idea how much I actually earned or how strong I had become to finally say no. Have you ever been treated by your own family like you're just a walking wallet? If you have, tell me where you're watching from so I'll know I'm not alone in this kind of pain. I was born and raised in Ohio, in an old wooden house at the end of a damp street where, every time it rained, the water flooded the walkway and the smell of mildew crept into the cracks of the walls. My father, Mark Grant, was a gentleman who spent his life wearing an oil-stained work shirt in the small garage down the block. He was the one who taught me that everything can be fixed if you're patient enough. My mother was different. She stayed home all the time, always seemed restless with her life, and often sighed while staring out the window at the luxury cars passing by. I still remember her voice, distant and wistful. "When Sophia is born, I'll finally be happy." I was only 10 then, too young to understand why she spoke as if my existence had never been enough. Sophia was born when I started middle school. The whole house lit up with laughter and new gifts. I still remember the day Mom brought her home. She looked at Sophia as if she were a miracle she had been waiting for all her life, while I stood quietly in the corner, holding the old teddy bear Dad had sewn from one of his jackets. As a child, I didn't understand that a mother's love could be divided, or rather, taken from one and given to another. All I knew was that whenever I tried to tell Mom about my perfect score on a math test, she would interrupt me and say, "Can you get that blanket for Sophia? She's cold." When I was 12, everything became clearer. My mother stopped coming to parent-teacher meetings, stopped asking what I ate or studied. Instead, she spent her afternoons taking pictures of Sophia in princess dresses, posting them on Facebook with captions like, "My only source of happiness." I was a good student, even won a district math competition once, but in her eyes, the only thing worth showing off was Sophia's pink dress and the tiny sparkling shoes that Richard, the man who often came by when my father wasn't home, had bought for her. My father knew everything, but he never said a word. I remember one evening when he sat at the kitchen table, his calloused hands wrapped tightly around a cup of cold coffee, his eyes distant. He said softly, "Amelia, sometimes people don't know how to cherish what they have until it's gone." I didn't fully understand what he meant back then. I just saw a sorrow in his eyes so deep it made my throat tighten. Then tragedy struck. When I was 14, Dad had a workplace accident. A car jack collapsed while he was working beneath a vehicle. He suffered broken ribs, a lung injury, and had to stay in the hospital for months. I still remember that afternoon when I called Mom to tell her what happened. She replied flatly, "I'm busy. Richard's taking Sophia to dance class." My hands trembled as I hung up the phone, unable to believe how cold her voice was. From that day on, I learned how to change my father's bandages, how to make porridge, and after school, I worked part-time at a small diner nearby to help pay for his medicine. 3 months later, my mother left for good. Not a single goodbye. She left behind a hastily scribbled note. "I have to think about Sophia's future." I stood in the empty house, the paper trembling in my hand, listening to the wind whistling through the old window frame. I didn't cry. I only felt hollow. The years that followed were a long, dark stretch. I went to school in the mornings and worked at night. The owner of the diner, a middle-aged man named Richard Hale, took pity on me. He let me start out washing dishes and then taught me how to make burgers with a crisp crust that wouldn't burn. He always saved leftovers for me to bring home to my dad. I had once thought Jack was just an ordinary boss, but over time, he became the only person I could trust besides my father. Dad grew weaker, but he still tried to smile every time I brought home good grades. Once, he held my hand, his voice rough and fading. "Don't let this world make you forget your kindness." I nodded, swallowing back tears. In that decaying wooden house, it was just the two of us, his coughing echoing between the cold drafts slipping through the cracks. When I was 17, he died. It was the coldest winter of my life. I can still remember that morning when I came to his bedside. His hand was already stiff and cold, that gentle face still wearing a faint smile. I sat there, calling his name over and over, but he didn't answer. His funeral was quiet, held on a gloomy afternoon. No flowers, no relatives, no mother or Sophia. Just me and Mr. Jack standing by the grave, the sound of earth hitting the coffin like soft, heavy drumbeats. Jack placed a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "He was proud of you, Amelia." I nodded, but inside I was so empty it felt as if I had died along with my father. That night, I went back to the wooden house, a house now filled only with the smell of stale smoke and the creak of old floorboards. I sat on the floor, staring at an old family photograph. My mother beaming, my father's hand resting on my shoulder, and me clutching a plastic doll. Sophia was nothing more than a faint curve in my mother's belly in that picture. I understood then that from this point on, I was completely alone. Yet, in the middle of that pain, a small flame flickered to life inside me. I would not live the kind of life they had. I would not need anyone's pity. I would stand on my own. Those years, though brutal, shaped the person I am today. From a child left behind in a damp Ohio house, I learned how to wash my own clothes, cook my own meals, and, most of all, rebuild my life from ashes. After my father's funeral, I stood alone in the empty house, the wind slipping through the cracks and scattering unpaid bills across the floor. I knew that if I stayed, I would be swallowed by poverty and painful memories. So that autumn, I packed a few changes of clothes, one of my father's old notebooks, and boarded a night bus to Seattle. I had nothing but a torn suitcase and a promise to myself. I would not repeat their lives. I would not depend, not beg, not wait for anyone to save me. I would save myself. The first years of college were the harshest but also the most defining of my life. I applied to the computer science program at the University of Washington, a school that, to anyone else, might have sounded like a fantasy. I had no parents to co-sign anything, no savings, only top grades and a scholarship letter I wrote over 3 sleepless nights, each word soaked with tears. When the email arrived that said, "Accepted with financial aid," I collapsed onto the floor of my temporary dorm room, tears streaming down my face. But the scholarship only covered tuition, not living expenses. I began working 3 jobs at once, making coffee at a small campus cafe, monitoring the computer lab from 10 at night until 2 in the morning, and tutoring freshmen in basic programming. Each night I slept 3 or 4 hours, my head spinning from exhaustion, but my heart refusing to stop. I would sit by the window, watching Seattle's lights ripple across the lake, whispering to myself, "Amelia, just hold on a little longer. Just a little longer." Sometimes, at the cafe where I worked, other students would order expensive drinks and talk about their vacations in Hawaii or trips to Europe. I counted my tips carefully to buy secondhand textbooks. Some nights I was so tired I fell asleep at my desk, pen still in hand, my laptop screen glowing with unfinished lines of code. Yet I felt happy because at least my life was mine to decide, and no one could take that away from me. I never forgot my father. Whenever I was exhausted, I would open his old notebook, where in pencil he had written, "Never let the world make you forget your kindness." I held on to that line like a compass, so I wouldn't turn into someone bitter like my mother, but I also wouldn't remain the weak child I once was. I learned to balance coldness with compassion, the logic of an engineer with the heart of an orphaned daughter. 4 years passed in relentless effort. I graduated at the top of my computer science class and was invited to give the commencement speech. As I stepped up to the podium and looked out over the sea of families filling the audience, I felt a hollow chill in my chest. My seat in the crowd was empty. No father, no mother, no sister. I tried not to let the tears fall. When the ceremony ended, others received flowers and posed for photos, while I sat alone on the steps, holding my diploma in my hands. Then my phone buzzed. A message from my mother appeared on the screen. Sophia is sick. Congratulations. No exclamation point, no question, no emotion. Just 6 words, cold as steel. I stared at them for a long time, then turned off my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. That night, I walked along the Fremont Bridge, the wind biting against my skin, and I made a silent promise to myself I would never need anyone again. After graduation, I was hired by a small AI startup. The office was in the basement of an old building, with concrete floors, bare walls, and the lingering scent of stale coffee in the air. But to me, it was paradise. I worked 16 hours a day, lived on instant noodles, slept on the office couch, and wrote thousands of lines of code to build our team's first machine learning system. Every time a project failed, I didn't lose hope. I had been too familiar with failure since childhood. Gradually, my work began to attract attention. A major tech company in Seattle, the kind of place I used to dream about, sent me an interview invitation. I walked into that interview wearing a rented suit, my palms damp with sweat. When they asked, "What makes you different from the other candidates?" I simply answered, "I don't have a way back." The interviewer paused for a moment, then smiled. A week later, I received the congratulatory email. I had been hired as a software engineer. In those first years there, I was like a climber who never stopped ascending. I worked late into the night, volunteered for every difficult project, always the first to arrive and the last to leave the office. I had no one to go home to, no one waiting for me, so work became the only place I truly belonged. I poured all my pain into fuel. Every time I saw my name on a performance report, I remembered the words, "Sophia is sick." Congratulations. They reminded me that love can be false, but effort never is. 3 years later, I had become an independent woman, not only financially but emotionally as well. My life had changed so much that even I sometimes couldn't recognize the little girl who once cried in that old wooden house in Ohio. Every morning, I woke up in an apartment on the 27th floor of a glass building overlooking Lake Union, where the sunlight reflected off the blue water and painted shimmering patterns across the ceiling. I would stand there sipping my coffee, watching small white sails drift lazily and listening to the gentle sound of waves against the shore. There was no more mildew, no more wind hissing through the cracks, only the stillness I had dreamed of for half my life. The silver Tesla Model Y parked in the garage downstairs was a gift I gave myself after 10 years of nonstop work. I didn't buy it to show off, but to prove to myself that I could steer my own life in every sense of the word. On the dashboard, I taped a small note that reads, "You did it, Dad." Every time I start the car, those words remind me of the man who taught me about kindness and of why I donate to an orphan scholarship fund every month in his memory. I don't follow any religion, but I believe that when you help someone stand up again, you continue the best part of the person who once raised you. My work had never been more stable. I'm now the lead software engineer at a rapidly growing AI company in Seattle. I head a research team developing natural language recognition systems where every line of code helps machines understand human emotion. Sometimes I find it ironic. I've spent my life teaching machines to feel, while the woman who gave birth to me never once understood mine. But maybe that's exactly why I'm good at what I do. I know what it's like to be misunderstood, to be dismissed, and I want to build technology that makes the world a little less cold. I don't have a family of my own, at least not in the traditional sense. I've dated a few times, but in the end, I've always chosen solitude. Not because I fear love, but because I've learned that peace is more valuable than romance. Instead of depending on someone, I've built a small life I genuinely love. I have 2 close friends. Liam, my lab colleague who always cracks jokes whenever I get too serious, and Nina, the architect who lives in the apartment across the hall and often brings over pastries on weekends, claiming, "Someone has to test them before I open my bakery." We're not the kind of friends who need to talk constantly, but we're the kind who can sit in silence for hours and still feel completely at ease. On autumn evenings, I like walking around the lake with my headphones on, listening to Fleetwood Mac or John Mayer, sometimes stopping to watch the sunset fall across the water. There are moments when I think my life has finally moved into a new chapter, a chapter of freedom. No one controls me, no one belittles me, no one makes me feel not good enough. There's only me, my work, and the peace I traded my youth to earn. And then, one day, the past came knocking. It was a Sunday morning, a light mist hanging over Seattle. I was making coffee when my phone buzzed a Facebook Messenger notification. When I saw the sender's name, my heart skipped a beat. Linda Grant. My mother. A name I thought I had left behind forever in Ohio, where the old wooden house had been sold to someone else years ago. I opened the message. A short line. Do you have time to talk? No greeting, no warmth. Just an empty question, enough to awaken the memories I had buried so deep. In that moment, images rushed back: the trembling hand of my father on his hospital bed, the note my mother left when she walked out, and the "Sophia is sick" text on my graduation day. It all played like a film in reverse, tightening my chest until I could barely breathe. I sat for a long time, staring at the glowing screen in the quiet kitchen. Outside, the mist was lifting, and soft sunlight filtered through the large glass window. I didn't know if I was trembling from anger or fear. Part of me wanted to reply, to ask, "Why are you remembering I exist only now?" But another part of me whispered coldly, "Don't open that door again, Amelia. You survived, don't go back." I didn't reply. I turned off my phone, poured coffee into my cup, and watched the steam rise like faint smoke from old memories. A sparrow landed on the balcony railing, tilted its head to look in, then flew away. I told myself that sometimes silence is the clearest answer of all. That day, I still went to work as usual, but my mind drifted. During a meeting, Liam noticed something was off. He leaned over and asked softly, "You okay?" I gave him a faint smile and said, "Just old stuff." He didn't ask more, just set a cup of coffee on my desk along with a small note that read, "Whatever it is, don't let it take away what you've built." I looked at those words for a long moment, then slipped the note into my wallet as a reminder that the past only has power if you let it. That evening, when I came home, I played soft music, and warm yellow light filled the room. I looked around. Everything was neat, quiet, carrying the faint scent of lavender. My life, though simple, was the result of years of effort and discipline. I had learned how to love myself without needing anyone's approval. Yet my mother's message felt like a tiny crack across that perfect glass. I didn't know what it would lead to, only that somewhere deep inside, I sensed it. This peace wasn't going to last. I set my phone on the table, turned off all notifications, and looked out the window. Across the Seattle sky, lights from the Space Needle shimmered and danced over the surface of the lake. I whispered to myself, "It's okay, Amelia. You've survived worse." But deep inside, something began to stir, like a small wave slowly gathering strength. I had no idea that in just a few days, the doorbell would ring and the woman who had abandoned me at 14 would be standing at my door with the sister she had always loved more than anyone else, and a request that could shatter the peace I had spent a lifetime building. That afternoon, a gray Friday in mid-December, with a light drizzle falling over Seattle, I was in the middle of finishing a project report when the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it was the delivery guy. I had just ordered a few new tech books. But when I stepped into the hallway and looked through the peephole, my heart dropped. It wasn't a delivery. It was my mother, Linda Grant. Standing beside her was Sophia, the sister I hadn't seen in more than 15 years. It took me several seconds to believe what I was seeing. Linda was unmistakable, even though time had etched deep lines around her mouth, and the once sharp glint in her eyes was dulled beneath tired layers of makeup. Still, her posture, that half-smile, and the luxury leather bag on her arm carried the same familiar aura, confident, demanding, and cold. Sophia, on the other hand, looked as if she'd stepped straight out of a fashion magazine's softly curled hair, bold red lipstick, a short fur coat, and Louboutin heels. Her gaze swept over me, not like she was looking at a person, but as if she were assessing a display item in a store window, the same sister who had once shared the same roof with me. I opened the door, my voice unconsciously lowering. "Mom, Sophia." Linda smiled softly, her expression smooth and practiced, as if we had only seen each other last week. "Amelia, you look so different. Grown up, successful. I heard you're working at some big company, right?" Leaning against the doorframe, I kept my tone calm. "Who did you hear that from?" "Oh, Seattle's a small world," she said, her voice syrupy and insincere. "News travels fast." I didn't invite them in, but Linda walked past me anyway, moving as naturally as if she still owned the place. Sophia followed, her heels striking the wooden floor in deliberate rhythm. The apartment was bathed in afternoon light, clean, orderly, carrying the soft scent of coffee and lavender oil. I noticed their eyes scanning the room, quietly assessing the value of everything they saw. Linda glanced at the painting on the wall, her tone hovering between compliment and inquiry. "This apartment must have cost quite a bit. I'm glad to see you're taking care of yourself. As for your sister," she sighed, heavy with meaning. "She's been having a bit of a hard time lately." I am. I crossed my arms and stayed silent. Linda went on. "Sophia just got divorced. Her husband left and stuck her with a pile of debt. She doesn't deserve to go through that." I turned to look at Sophia. She lifted her chin slightly, her lips pressed tight. "It's just a rough patch," she said, trying to sound composed. Linda jumped in quickly. "You know, her wedding cost over $80,000, all their savings, plus loans." I told her not to go overboard, but Richard, oh, you remember, my ex-husband said our family had to maintain appearances. And now, well, they've lost everything. She paused, fixing her gaze on me, her tone softening with calculated sweetness. "I'm not asking for charity, just help your sister out a little. $150,000, that's all. Think of it as sisterly support. With your career, that's probably nothing." I looked at them, saying nothing. Outside, the rain tapped lightly against the glass. Sophia turned toward me, her eyes flashing with a mix of irritation and pleading. "You have a home, a car, a dream job. I'm only asking for a small part. I'll pay you back when I'm stable again." Her voice took me back to those old afternoons when I'd come home from school exhausted while she sat in our mother's lap, soaking in every drop of affection. Back then, I believed that if I worked harder, behaved better, maybe Mom would look at me, just once, the same way she looked at her. But some people, no matter how much you try, will only ever see someone else. I set my coffee cup down on the table, my tone calm but cold. "Why should I save you from the mistakes you made yourself?" Sophia frowned, and Linda tilted her head, looking at me with that familiar mix of disdain and accusation. "Because that's what a good daughter does for her family." One. I let out a quiet laugh, one without warmth. A good mother doesn't abandon her child at 14 to chase a richer man. The air in the room froze. Linda stiffened, then tried to mask her unease by adjusting the necklace around her throat. Sophia looked at me, her eyes glistening, not with shame, but with anger. "You're so cold," she said quietly. "You have no idea what it feels like to lose everything." I met her gaze. "You're wrong, Sophia. I do. I lost everything when I was 14 when Mom left with you. But I never used that as an excuse to make someone else responsible for my life." Linda shot up from her seat, her voice sharp and cutting. "Amelia, don't forget who gave you life. Blood is still blood. The more you have, the more you should share." I looked her straight in the eyes, unblinking. "Not all blood is family." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Sophia lowered her eyes, and Linda stayed silent for a few seconds before pulling a business card from her purse and placing it on the table. "If you change your mind, call me," she said, her voice wavering between pleading and warning. "Don't let your sister suffer because of your cold heart." I didn't pick up the card. I just gave a small nod, my voice calm. "I'll remember." Linda grabbed Sophia's hand, and the sharp sound of their heels echoed across the wooden floor. When the door closed behind them, silence settled once more over the apartment. I turned toward the window outside. The rain had grown heavier. On the table lay the card, trimmed in gold, the name embossed across it. Linda Grant, financial consultant. I stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up, turned it between my fingers, and dropped it into the trash. That night, I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamps spilling through the window. I thought about my mother's words, what a good daughter should do for her family. Maybe in her world, love and money were the same thing. But in mine, family wasn't a commodity that could be bargained for. I had once dreamed of them coming back, of hearing an apology, but now that they were really here, all I felt was emptiness. I stepped out onto the balcony, letting the rain fall onto my hands, feeling the cold seep into my skin. I knew this wasn't the end. With my mother, no was never an answer she accepted. And just as I had sensed, a few days later things began to slip out of my control when they decided to take one more step, crossing a line I thought I had sealed shut forever. A week after that visit, when it seemed everything had settled, I received a security alert email from the bank. The subject line flashed on my laptop screen. Unusual sign, in attempt detected. I assumed at first it was a system error. I always use two-factor authentication, but when I opened it, my heart gave a small jolt. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. from an IP address right here in Seattle, and someone had tried 3 times in a row to sign in using credentials matching my account. At first I was just puzzled. But when the bank confirmed that someone had entered my username character for character, I knew this wasn't coincidence. No one but my mother and Sophia knew my personal information that well. A chill ran straight down my spine. I immediately pulled up the building's security camera software. When I rewound the footage from that night, the image on the screen made my blood run cold. In the grainy glow of the hallway lights, a hooded figure appeared at my door. She bent down, rummaged through something in her bag, and then pulled out a black access card. In just a few seconds, the lock light flashed green click, and the door opened. She stepped inside, back to the camera, but when she tilted her head, I saw the face clearly. It was Sophia. My heart pounded wildly. I zoomed in on the frame. There was no mistaking it. The same hair, the same walk. Sophia, inside my apartment, the place where I slept every night, the place I had believed was absolutely safe. She moved around the room, opened desk drawers, paused at the file cabinet where I kept my financial documents, then left less than 5 minutes later. Nothing stolen of obvious value, nothing disturbed, just information or images. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I called the building's security department immediately. A man named Aaron, the head of security, picked up. His voice was low, professional. After I explained what happened, he was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Actually, there's something strange. Last week, a woman called claiming to be your mother, Linda Grant. She asked about reissuing an access card for a relative who'd lost theirs. We refused, but it looks like someone still found a way." I went numb. They had used my name to get at my security information, impersonating family ties to extract data. A flood of questions crashed through my mind. Why were they doing this? What could they possibly want from me? I didn't owe them a single cent. But for my mother, maybe my success had become her property, a resource she believed she had the right to reclaim. I opened my laptop and checked my emails again, only to find a strange message from a financial company. The subject line read, "Your account verification documents are ready." When I clicked it open, there was a fake bank statement with my name clearly printed, but the balance tripled. Below, under "Requested by," it said, "Linda Grant." My stomach churned. They were planning to use my identity to scam or borrow money, or worse, to smear me. I didn't sleep that night. I opened every file, took screenshots, downloaded all the evidence, and stored it on an external drive. When I caught my own reflection in the laptop screen, dark circles under my eyes, my face cold and tense, I realized I was trembling. But it wasn't fear, it was anger. Anger at being betrayed again by the very people who once called themselves my family. The next morning, I called my mother directly. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. "Amelia," she said, her voice still calm. "I knew you'd call." "Why?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "Why did you try to access my accounts? Why did Sophia enter my apartment? Why did you call security pretending to be me?" There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, then a mocking laugh. "Are you paranoid? I don't know what you're talking about." "I have all the evidence," I replied evenly. "The camera footage, the emails, the fake statements. If either of you takes one more step, I'll go to the police." A long pause followed. Then I heard a cold, brittle laugh on the line. "You'll regret betraying your blood. No matter how much money or status you have, you're still the child I gave birth to. I have rights." I closed my eyes, drew a deep breath, and said, "No, Mom. The only right you have left is the right to stop." Then I hung up. I sat still, staring at the darkened phone. My hands trembled slightly, but there was no longer any fear inside me. Only a cold clarity, like a thin sheet of steel wrapped around my heart. I realized that some relationships must die for me to truly live. That afternoon, I went to the Capitol Hill police station with copies of all the evidence. Officer Reed looked everything over and nodded. "You did the right thing coming in early. This is trespass and identity fraud." He advised me to change all my passwords, lock my accounts, and file an official report so there would be a record if they continued. I signed the paperwork, my hand still a little shaky, but I felt lighter. That evening, I sat by the window watching raindrops bead on the glass. In the reflection, I saw a different woman, not the 14-year-old left behind, not the exhausted scholarship student, but someone who could protect herself. I picked up a blank sheet of paper and wrote down what I needed to do. Contact a lawyer. Change every account, password, and phone number. Report back to the security company to block all contact from Linda and Sophia. Sever every line of communication completely. When I finished writing, it felt like signing a declaration of freedom. From now on, I would not let anyone cross the boundaries of my safety again. Not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. That night, I sat in front of my computer, watching lines of code stream across the screen, the work I did, the language I could control. I thought, maybe life is a lot like programming. One wrong line can crash the system, but if you debug, learn, and rewrite the syntax correctly, you can make it run smoother than before. This time, I would rewrite the program of my life with no more errors named Linda and Sophia Grant. I knew I couldn't keep handling this alone anymore. What my mother and Sophia had done wasn't just insulting or invasive, it had crossed into deliberate financial attacks. I needed someone who understood the law and, more importantly, understood toxic family dynamics. After many nights of searching and weighing my options, I reached out to attorney Sarah Carter, a well-known specialist in cases of financial abuse within families. Her voice over the phone was deep and steady, without a trace of judgment. After I summarized everything, she simply said, "Amelia, from this point on, you're no longer a victim. We're going to put an end to this." We met at her office, a small but orderly room in downtown Seattle. Sarah was in her early 40s, petite but with sharp, clear eyes. On her desk, she neatly arranged the documents I'd brought. Security camera images, call logs, bank warning emails, and a copy of the deed to my apartment. She examined each detail carefully, then nodded. "This is enough to open a case. I'll file for a restraining order against both your mother and Sophia. In addition, I'll send a legal warning letter demanding that they cease all actions violating your property and identity." Hearing those words, it felt as though I could finally breathe after weeks of holding my breath. For the first time in my life, someone was standing on my side, not with soft, sentimental comfort, but with the weight of the law. Sarah looked at me and spoke slowly. "I've seen so many women like you, independent, successful, but still bound to the people they love most by guilt. Don't let them use family to make you endure anymore." I nodded faintly, my throat tightening. Just 3 days later, the Seattle court officially approved the restraining order. I received a copy stamped in red with a clear line of text. Any contact, in person or digital, is strictly prohibited. I stared at that sentence for a long time, my fingers trembling as they touched the paper. Not from fear, but from relief. For 20 years, I had believed the boundary between me and them existed only in my mind. Now it had become real ink on white paper. Following Sarah's instructions, I implemented a series of protections, changing every password, locking old accounts, changing my phone number, even updating my security credentials at work. I also moved 20% of my assets into a private charity fund called the Mark Grant Scholarship Fund, not just to protect my finances, but to anchor them to something good. In the email to my accountant, I wrote, "If anyone asks why, tell them I'm investing in the future, not the past." For the first few days, everything was quiet. I went to work, refocused, slowly found my rhythm again. But on Thursday evening, while checking my work email, an anonymous message popped up in the inbox of an old social account. The words appeared like a scratch across the screen. "You're cruel. Mom is suffering. I don't believe you can live peacefully after treating your own blood this way." I didn't need to guess. It was Sophia. Even using a different account, the style and punctuation were unmistakable, emotional, half accusation, half provocation. I didn't reply. I just took a screenshot and forwarded it to Sarah. She called almost immediately, her voice firm and steady. "Good. Don't react. Everything you document will strengthen the case. Their goal is to shake you. When you stay silent, they expose their own weakness." I listened and answered quietly, "I understand." But after hanging up, I found myself staring at that old message again. The words, "Mom is suffering," echoed in my head, pulling me back into memories I had tried so hard to bury. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't guilt I felt anymore. It was pity. I turned off the screen, took a deep breath, and stepped out onto the balcony. That night, Seattle was draped in a soft drizzle, the wind carrying a chill from Lake Union that brushed against my face. I thought of my father. What would he have said if he were still alive? Maybe he would have told me I did the right thing. That love doesn't mean letting others walk all over you. I lifted my head toward the gray sky, the rain rolling down my cheeks, cold but strangely peaceful. A year passed since the day I ended all contact with them. My life slowly found its rhythm again, quiet, steady, free of anonymous messages, late-night calls, or that uneasy feeling whenever I stepped into my apartment. Seattle moved into autumn, the air crisp and cool, the trees around Lake Union beginning to turn gold. I still went to work every morning, still spent my days with my engineering team testing new lines of code. Some days, I almost forgot the past. There was only work, laughter from colleagues, and Nina's soft giggle from across the hall whenever she burned her toast. I thought all the ugliness had finally been washed away by time. But life, in its own mysterious way, always finds a way to balance the scales. One March morning, I was sitting in the small cafe beneath my building, sipping coffee, when the TV mounted on the wall suddenly flashed a bold headline. "Businessman Richard Hale under investigation for large-scale financial fraud." I froze. Richard Hale, the very man my mother had left my father for. His image filled the screen, a tense face surrounded by reporters as he exited the federal courthouse. The anchor read quickly through the details. He was accused of money laundering, tax fraud, and embezzling investment funds. I set my cup down, an odd feeling rising in me, not joy, not pain. Just a hollow stillness, like hearing rain fall on a place you once hated but no longer belonged to. A few days later, the news spread across every local paper. They said Linda Grant, his wife and partner of over 15 years, was under investigation as an accomplice who had known about his activities but failed to report them. Their house in Bellevue, the mansion once featured in lifestyle magazines, had been sealed off for asset investigation. I looked at the images of police tape stretched across their gates, and in that moment I thought only one thing. Everything she chose instead of me was now crumbling. I didn't feel happy. I didn't laugh. I only felt empty. Because when you witness the downfall of those who once hurt you, there's no sense of victory, only the realization that everything is far too late. The years that could have been used to love were spent on lies. As for Sophia, news about her surfaced just as quickly. An old acquaintance from the tech community, someone who had coincidentally gone to college with her, sent me a link to an article on a public forum. Socialite Sophia Hale declares bankruptcy after credit cards revoked and home foreclosed. I clicked on it and saw a photo of her standing outside the courthouse, her face weary, stripped of the expensive makeup and the proud glow she once wore. Below the article were hundreds of comments, some mocking, some pitying. I closed the page. Not out of sympathy, but because I didn't want to look at another version of pain this time, one she had built for herself. That night, I came home late. The rain had returned, drops tapping softly against the window pane. I sat on the sofa, turned on the desk lamp, and tried to focus on reading project materials for work. But my mind drifted elsewhere. Memories began to surface, the image of my mother smiling brightly in the kitchen when I was little, her voice reading bedtime stories to me. The nights when Sophia cried and I was the one mixing her milk, then the memory of my mother walking away, leaving behind that scrawled note. All of it intertwined, as if my mind were testing whether I could still feel anger. But strangely, I felt nothing. No hatred, no affection, just exhaustion. 2 weeks later, one evening after work, I opened my mailbox in the lobby and found a cream-colored envelope tucked among advertisements. There was no return address, only handwriting so familiar it made my heart skip a beat. To Amelia. I brought it upstairs, sat down at my desk, and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten letter, something I hadn't seen from my mother since childhood. The handwriting leaned unevenly across the page, shaky and broken, as if the writer had been crying while writing. Amelia. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I want to say, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were hurting too. I thought I was the only one suffering, the only one forced to make hard choices. But I was wrong. I chose wrong in everything, the wrong man, the wrong life, and worst of all, I lost the one child who truly loved me even when I didn't deserve it. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know now I understand. Linda. I read it over and over. Some lines were blurred, probably by her tears, but instead of feeling moved, I just sat there silently. No tears, no anger. Just the quiet sense of reading an old chapter of a book that once hurt deeply, but no longer had the power to reach my heart. I folded the letter back into the envelope and placed it in a drawer, not to keep it, but to close it. After putting away my mother's letter and making the final donation to the fund, I realized there was still a heaviness inside me. Not from hatred, but from something unhealed. I had cut them off. I had won. Yet some nights, I still woke up in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering, am I really okay or just pretending to be strong? The old memories still came, not to wound me anymore, but like ghosts wanting to hear me say goodbye. So, on a quiet, late autumn morning, I decided to begin therapy. My therapist's name was Helen Strauss, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and a voice soft as breath. Her office was on the 8th floor of an old building in downtown Seattle, its cream-colored walls and fabric-covered sofa warmed by the afternoon light, with a window overlooking the park. During our very first session, before I had even finished telling my story, she gave me a small, knowing smile and said, Amelia, sometimes saying no is the only way left to love yourself. I froze. No one had ever said that to me before. For years, I had believed that love meant endurance, that if I didn't save them, I was the bad one. But Helen helped me see that sometimes, kindness toward yourself is the highest form of compassion. In the sessions that followed, I began unpacking every fragment of memory, the abandonment of my childhood, my father's death, the exhausted years of college, and that false reunion the year before. Helen never interrupted, never looked at me with pity. She just listened. Sometimes she jotted a few words in her small notebook, then said, You've lived as if you had to prove you were worthy of love, but you forgot you're worthy simply because you exist. Hearing that, tears began to fall, not in sobs, but quietly, like a stream that had long been dammed finally finding its way free. In the months that followed, I learned how to let go. I stopped checking the news about my mother and Sophia. I stopped wondering how they were. I stopped blaming myself for not saving them from themselves. I began to look back on everything, not as a victim, but as someone who had survived the storm. Helen taught me a release ritual, a practice of letting go. I wrote down everything that had ever caused me pain, line by line, then took the paper out to the balcony, lit a candle, and set it aflame. As the fire licked along the paper's edges, I felt as if I, too, was finally being released from everything that once held me captive. I began reorganizing my apartment, starting with the drawers I had once been too afraid to open. I threw away everything I no longer needed: old papers, faded family photos, even the wool scarf my mother had given me when I was 12. I didn't get rid of them out of anger, but because I no longer needed them to remember. I changed the curtains, repainted the walls a soft ivory, and bought a few green plants to line the windowsill. Every morning, sunlight filtered through the leaves and fell gently across my desk. Once, Nina came over and said, "Your place finally looks like it can breathe again." I smiled and replied, "Maybe I can too." Life started to feel lighter. I began making time for the small things I used to ignore: morning walks around the lake, cooking instead of ordering takeout, listening to classical music instead of sitting in silence. I realized healing doesn't come from a single moment, but from hundreds of small choices you make every day. One afternoon, while sitting in my usual cafe, I opened my laptop and wrote a short post on a women's forum. I used to think independence meant needing no one. But really, independence is knowing you can stand alone and still choosing to love when you want to. I never expected what happened next. The post was shared thousands of times. Dozens of women messaged me to say thank you. One woman named Kara wrote, "I read your story and cried. My family treated me like an ATM too. Thank you for making me feel less alone." I read every word, and my heart felt strangely warm. From there, I began writing a blog. At first, it was just a place to record my thoughts after therapy lessons, reflections, things I wished I'd heard when I was younger. But slowly, it became a shared space for women who had been hurt by their own families. I called the blog Rewritten because I believed everyone has the power to rewrite their own story. Every evening after work, I made a cup of tea, opened my laptop, and replied to messages. Some women told me their parents controlled them with money. Others said they were belittled for not being as successful as their siblings. One simply wrote, "I read your post and had the courage to leave home today." I read them all, cried a little, then smiled. With each message I received, another piece of my own soul began to heal. Helen once said during a therapy session, "When you turn pain into language, it stops being a burden, it becomes a light." I think she was right. I no longer felt ashamed of my past. I began to talk about it the way one talks about an old chapter in a book. There were dark pages, yes, but through them I learned the value of light. In the 9th month of therapy, Helen ended our session with a simple sentence. "Amelia, you've learned to love yourself not as something foreign, but as naturally as breathing." I smiled, feeling a quiet, calm settle in my chest. The panic no longer came when I thought of my mother. The nightmares of my father on his hospital bed had faded. What remained was me, a lighter, steadier version of myself, finally grateful for life. That night, I wrote one final entry on my blog. There are wounds that don't need anyone to heal them, only time and the courage to face them. One day, you'll realize you've walked out of the storm not because it stopped, but because you've learned how to walk in the rain. Then I turned off the lights and opened the window, letting the night breeze drift in. In that quiet space, I could hear my own steady breathing, soft like waves brushing against a distant shore. And I knew at last I had truly begun to live. 2 years later, my life had taken a different turn, no longer centered around pain, but around giving to others what I once needed most. The blog, Rewritten, had grown into a small community, then into a volunteer group. The people who once read my posts, who cried over their own stories, had become friends, companions, and fellow travelers. In our group meetings, There was a young woman forced by her parents to shoulder their debt, a single mother who had escaped a financially controlling husband, and a few orphaned kids who had received scholarships to study programming. I often thought, if my father were still alive, he would want me to help those searching for faith in themselves again. So that September, I decided to found a scholarship fund in his name. The Mark Grant Foundation. The foundation was created to support children abandoned or exploited financially by their families, children like me, the ones who were never chosen to be loved. I remember the opening day vividly. The Seattle sky was unusually clear, the sunlight sparkling across Lake Union like glass. The hall was decorated simply white chrysanthemums, a sign that read, Mark Grant Foundation, build the future, not the burden. I didn't invite many guests, just close friends, the volunteer team, a few journalists, and the first scholarship recipients. When the host invited me to the podium, I looked around. In that small room, there was no mother, no Sophia, no one from my past, but I didn't feel empty. Before me were faces filled with trust, eyes bright with hope. I smiled, took the microphone, and spoke slowly. For many years, I lived feeling like I owed a debt. I thought I was obligated to pay for other people's mistakes, that family was something to hold on to, even when it tore me apart. But today, I want to say this. No one is obligated to pay for someone else's wrongs, especially when they were never loved in return. And if anyone has ever made you feel like you're not enough, remember this. You were not born to fuel someone else's disappointment. You were born to rewrite your own story. The room fell silent, then erupted into long, heartfelt applause. I looked toward the sign bearing my father's name, Mark Grant, and felt as though he was smiling at me from somewhere far away. Not out of pride, but because I had finally understood what he once meant when he said, "You can't fix other people, but you can rebuild yourself." The ceremony ended in a warm, glowing atmosphere. As everyone began to leave, I stayed behind, sitting alone while the late afternoon light streamed through the glass panels, painting the hall in shades of gold. I pulled out my phone to send a few photos to the volunteer team, then a new message appeared from an unfamiliar number. The words made my throat tighten. "Amelia, we just saw your story on the news. My husband and I still remember you, the young girl who worked at our diner all those years ago. We're proud of you. Mrs. Miller, Ohio." I froze, tears spilling before I could stop them. Mrs. Miller, the diner owner, who once gave me a free meal when I was hungry, who wrapped a sandwich and said, "Take it home for your dad, it's cold out." More than 15 years had passed, and she still remembered me. I typed back, "Thank you. That meal showed me kindness was real. I hope one day I can invite you to Seattle, not to work, but to rest." I set the phone down and looked out the window. Seattle's autumn was gentle that day. The trees along the lake had turned a fiery orange, and a soft wind carried the damp scent of recent rain. I stood up and stepped out onto the balcony. The late afternoon light wrapped the city in a warm golden hue, reflecting across the water in a shimmer. I whispered to myself, almost like a secret. Family isn't always the place you're born into. Sometimes, it's the place you build. Hansen. I tilted my head back, looking at the sky clear and high as if it had never held a wound. I knew I had walked a long road to reach this moment. And that journey, though marked with loss, had led me back to the most precious thing of all. Freedom of the soul. A month later, I decided to take the trip my father had once dreamed of, driving along the Washington coast. I rented a small car, packed a few books and a camera. The road traced the edge of the cliffs, the vast blue ocean stretching below. I played Fleetwood Mac as the wind blew through my hair, the salt of the sea mixing with each breath. Everything was so peaceful it felt as if time itself had slowed. I stopped at a high overlook, stepped out, let the wind rush against my face, the smell of the ocean flooding in. I closed my eyes and let myself dissolve into the wide open space. I remembered it all, the contempt in my mother's eyes when I refused to give money, the cold embrace of Sophia at that false reunion. Memories that once stabbed at my heart now felt like distant specks of light, fading with each wave below. I wasn't angry anymore. Only light, like invisible cords once wrapped around my heart, had finally rotted away and fallen free. I sat down on the edge of the cliff, opened the laptop I had brought, and began writing one final email to my mother. I didn't know where she was anymore, but her old address was still saved in my contacts like a locked door I had never reopened. I typed slowly, one word at a time. Mom, I don't hate you anymore, but I'm not coming back. Please live the rest of your life in peace, if you can. I hope someday you'll also learn to love yourself the way I finally did. Amelia. I read it once more, then hit send. No tears, no shaking hands, just a quiet sense of closure, soft, complete. I closed the laptop, set it on the passenger seat, and looked out at the sea. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in pale red. The wind picked up, tugging at my coat. I smiled faintly and spoke softly, as if narrating the final lines of my own story. I used to think family was the place we must always return to. But sometimes, to truly live, we have to dare to walk away. I didn't lose my family, I just found myself. I stood, taking a deep breath. The ocean before me stretched endlessly. Somewhere out there, I knew, there were still scars that hadn't fully healed, but they no longer frightened me. Because now I understood healing isn't about forgetting, it's about continuing to live without letting the past define you. By the time I got back to the car, twilight had fallen, and the city lights were beginning to glimmer in the distance. I turned on the headlights and drove into the night, a quiet peace settling over me. On the dashboard, the small note was still there, the one I had written years ago. You did it, Dad. Dad. I smiled, let the night wind rush through the window, and knew my journey had finally led me into the light.